Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Professor Seth Monahan, and you might want to stick around because this is the video where you can learn how modulation works. And if we're gonna talk about modulation, where better to start than with a theme that changes keys 4 times in only 8 bars. This is the slow movement from Beethoven's Opus 28 Piano Sonata, and I'm going to start by walking you through all the key changes, and then we'll zoom out to make some important observations about modulation in general. So the movement as a whole is in D minor, and it opens with a parallel period whose first phrase ends with a half cadence in the tonic. But then the second phrase starts in F major. It's basically a transposition of the opening up by third. But the phrase doesn't close in that key. Mid-phrase, Beethoven takes us into A minor, which is the key of the closing PAC. But the first ending instantly resets the tonic back to D minor, just in time for the whole thing to repeat. Here's how the entire theme sounds. Now, because I'm already running out of space here, we're going to spend the next few minutes bouncing back and forth between the score and this space over here, where we can stack up some important observations. And the first of these is more of a clarification, just to head off any confusion. To start, I need you to know that the term modulation refers to an actual change of key such that a new note becomes the tonic. It's not something that happens, for instance, if we have simply borrowed a chord from some other key. We went over this in our introduction to applied chords. This chord right here, 7/7 of 5, might be borrowed from the key of A minor. Here's how it sounds in its home key. But using it here doesn't put us in that key. It still takes us to A, but that A is clearly acting as 5 here in D minor. Now, more importantly, lots of modulations happen in a way that we might describe as smooth, with some area of overlap between the two keys. We can see this in the second system of the Beethoven theme. My original analysis had the key of A minor starting here with the predominant in bar 6. But if we want to know how Beethoven pulls off this key change so seamlessly, we need to go back one chord and notice that F major, the tonic of the previous key, is also a chord in A minor. It's 6, the submediant. This is what analysts call a pivot chord. It's a point of overlap between the two keys and a chord that we can hear having 2 different meanings. Let's really think about this. Moving into that F major chord, it's going to sound like the tonic in F major. But if we quote-unquote listen backwards from the A minor part of the phrase, we can choose to hear it as a 6 chord in that key with a bridging function leading into the predominant. Now, before we re-listen to that entire second phrase, I want to talk for a second about this chord too. This is what I call the modulation's breakaway chord, which is to say, it's the first chord in the new key that flatly contradicts the old one. It's a chord that doesn't make sense in the old key. Now, I want to be very clear about this. I don't just mean it's a chord that can't be labeled in the old key. We could certainly label this in the old key. It would be 7 half diminished 6/5 of 5. But why would we do that? 7 half diminished 6/5 of 5 isn't really a chord in this style. If we're thinking in terms of how F major actually works, it's an anomaly. It's also a signal, if we're listening carefully, it's a signal that F might be losing its grip on the music. And as it turns out, it's a chord that we need to understand in terms of what comes after, not what comes before. So let's listen to that second phrase one more time, all the way through, keeping an ear out for the smoothness of the modulation and asking ourselves whether we can hear that F major pivot chord having a kind of double meaning. Now, it's important to know that not all modulations are quote-unquote smooth like this. Some are abrupt with no pivot chords at all. We see this in Beethoven's very first modulation. Notice that he takes us from the half cadence in D minor to the new tonic F with no connecting material between them except for this one passing tone G natural. Students often think that modulation is always some complex, arcane process, and sometimes it is. But there are plenty of cases where we just sort of swerve from one key into another with no fuss at all. Listen again here. The theme's very last modulation is also pretty abrupt in this way. Beethoven's PAC gives us only a half beat of the new tonic before this three-note turnaround figure points us immediately back toward D minor. Let's listen again. Next, you should know that most modulations involve cadences, though not always in the same way. A lot of the time, composers will change keys and then immediately follow up with an authentic cadence to cement the sound of that new tonic in our ears. Beethoven does this with his A minor modulation at the end of the second phrase. The other two modulations also relate to cadences, but in the opposite way. Instead of coming before cadences, they come after. F major enters right after the cadence in D minor, and D minor enters right after the cadence in A minor. And if you think about this, it makes its own kind of sense. Cadences, even half cadences, tell us that a musical span has reached some kind of conclusion. They create a break in the musical flow, and with that, an opportunity for something new to begin just after. That's why it doesn't feel jarring when Beethoven leaps from D minor into F major at the system break. The half cadence gives us just enough punctuation to open our ears to the possibility of something new. Okay, moving on. Most modulations involve cadences, but I think all of them involve the dominant of the new key. And I say this because you can't really claim to be in a key without a dominant function to point you toward tonic. In other words, it's dominants that make tonics into tonics. So notice that the most ephemeral modulation here, the one to F major, involves only two chords, tonic and its dominant, without anything as assertive as a cadence. This brings us to another point. Modulations can and do vary in strength. The strongest modulations take us to keys with real staying power. We get lots of music in that new key with lots of cadential reinforcement. With weaker modulations, we might not stay in the key very long, or it might not have much or even any cadential support. In fact, some are so weak that we could debate whether we've changed keys at all. Beethoven's modulation to F major here is weak in this sense, which is to say, I know people who would reject just on principle the idea that we could be in F major for only a bar and a half here. I don't agree with them, but I do think there are plenty of cases where we could legitimately debate whether a key change had actually happened. In fact, I talked about this a bit at the end of video 26. You might remember that I showed you this Mozart theme and argued that we could potentially hear it either ending with a half cadence in D or with a PAC in A. It's a point worth revisiting today. So I'm going to play it for you twice. The first time, I want you to try to hear it as a half cadence. More specifically, I want you to try to hear the 4 melodic notes leading into the cadence as scale degrees 1, 7, 6, and 5 in D major. Give it a shot. Okay, now, wipe the slate clean. I want you to try to hear those same 4 notes as 4, 3, 2, 1 in A major. Try to hear that last note as completely stable, not wanting to go anywhere. Now, maybe one of those sounds more convincing to you than the other, but I hope you can at least sort of hear the ambiguity that I'm talking about. If you can, then you might find yourself wondering how Mozart might have made the modulation less ambiguous, which is to say, stronger, such that it gave us a firmer footing in A major. Well, as it happens, I posed that very question in video 26, and I offered one way we could rewrite those last 3 bars to make the modulation stronger. Now, the applied chord to 5 points us toward A a bar earlier. The melody includes the leading tone of the new key now, that didn't happen before. And, this is crucial, the dominant of A is now approached by its own applied dominant with that 4, sharp 4, 5 bass line that leaves no doubt at all that we are cadencing in A major. All of this brings us to our last point, which might also be the most important one. In most cases, modulations can't be analyzed mechanically by just looking at the page and puzzling through things. It requires active listening, flexibility, and a willingness to reflect on what you're hearing and why. Now, our opening example made all of this look relatively easy, but I picked it for that reason, because it was easy to analyze. The examples ahead are trickier. Often there's not just a pivot chord, instead there'll be multiple possible pivot chords, each of which points to a slightly different hearing of the passage. Or maybe there's no pivot chord at all. In any case, it ends up being a matter of musical judgment, not just algorithmic labeling. But before we get to those examples, we need to ask, if a composer wants to change keys, where is he or she likely to go? That is a huge question, and one that depends on the era and the type of work involved. But in the Baroque and Classical periods, there were pretty rigid defaults for the first important modulation in any piece. If a work started in major, it would nearly always modulate to the key of the dominant. Works in minor gave composers more options. They could modulate either to the relative major or to the key of the minor dominant, or sometimes they do both in that order. That's actually what Beethoven did in our first excerpt, going from D minor, up a third to F major, up a third to A minor. So from this point forward, it's all show and tell. I've chosen 6 pieces to analyze, and they all have a few things in common. Each of them modulates to one of these 3 default keys, and each of them is built like the opening example in that they're all parallel periods that modulate during the second phrase. But they all work a little bit differently, so we can pick up a few new insights with each piece. Let's start with modulations to the dominant in major keys. Here's a theme from Mozart's K284 Piano Sonata, and as you can see, the antecedent phrase is all by-the-book functional harmony in a single key. The consequent phrase then starts on 1/6, but then immediately lands on a chord that doesn't fit easily into D major. It's a B minor triad in first inversion. This would be a 6/6 chord in D, and that's definitely not a thing. So we might want to ask if this is the breakaway chord. And if we look ahead, we find that all of the remaining harmony fits very comfortably into A major. The B minor triad becomes 2-6, which moves to 5-7. And then on to a complete cadential cycle and a PAC. Before we listen though, let's go back to the key change and look for pivot chords. Turns out we get exactly one. The first chord of the phrase initially sounds like 1-6 in D, but we can listen backwards from the new key to hear it as 4-6 in A major, which is another predominant harmony. The next example is the slow movement from Haydn's Last Symphony, number 104 in D. And when we listen to the antecedent, pay special attention to the deceptive resolution of the first dominant. Now look at the consequent phrase. Haydn keeps the original bass line for 2 bars, but then he pulls a kind of double deception. Now, instead of 6, we get a series of applied chords to 5, resolving to what seems to be a 5-6. And from the look of the bass line, we might assume that bar 6 has an overall passing function, right? With the bass rising from D through E to F sharp. But we've got a few problems here. One of them is this chord. It's 7 half diminished 6-5 of 5 again. It's just not common at all. It's a red flag. Second, we've got 5-7 moving into applied chords to 5. That's not really a thing either. 5 triad? Absolutely, but not 5-7. So another red flag. But for me, the biggest problem is simply that I don't hear bar 7 as a 5 chord at all. By this point, it sounds to me like we're already in D major, where we stay for the rest of the phrase. And I actually feel the same way about bar 6. For me, the jolt of that surprise resolution forces me to rethink where I am tonally. And that C sharp pulls so hard toward D, it's very easy for me to hear it as a new leading tone. So for me, there just isn't a convincing pivot chord here. The deceptive resolution of 5-7 just yanks us into a new key where we hang out for a few more bars. Have a listen. So here's another Haydn example, and another kind of tricky one. As always, the first phrase stays firmly in the tonic, now C major. Then the second phrase starts with 5 chords that could be reconciled with C major. It would be 3 5s and 2 applied chords to 5. It's only when we get to E minor in bar 6 that we find a chord that we wouldn't normally expect in C major. That's more likely to be 6 in G major. And everything from there to the end is definitely in G. So it would be perfectly reasonable to ask whether E minor is our breakaway chord and the chord before it our pivot. But let's not jump to any conclusions here. Instead, let's listen to the whole excerpt twice and see if we can tell where it actually feels like we enter G major. And if you need a way to focus your hearing, listen to the top voice here in terms of scale degrees. There are 3 Gs in this little tune. Where does the note G start to feel like tonic? And again with a real orchestra. So I don't know how you hear it, but to me, it actually sounds like the entire second phrase is in G major. So if there's any overlap at all, it would just be on that first chord of the phrase, on that one beat pickup. That, for me, is the only pivot chord, if there even is one. Let's listen one more time. All right, up next, a few examples in minor that end in a relative major. This is the opening of Haydn's second Opus 55 string quartet in F minor, and like every example so far, the 4-bar antecedent ends on a half cadence. But the consequent is a little tricky in that all 5 of its chords could, in theory, appear in the tonic key of F minor. We've got 7-7, tonic, 4-6, 5-7 of 3, and then 3. But listen to the phrase as a whole, and tell me if that analysis of the ending seems right to you. This is that thing we talked about in the last video. If you're in minor and you end a phrase on 5 of 3 going to 3, you've modulated to the relative major whether you meant to or not. And if we look at it that way, there's a nice clean pivot chord at the end of bar 6. The B flat minor triad in first inversion is 4-6 in F minor, but it's also 2-6 in A flat major. I especially like this because the chord has the same function in both keys. If Haydn had stayed in the original key, though, that D flat in the bass would have gone down by step to the dominant of F. But instead, he takes that bass D flat up by step to the dominant of A flat. Here's the whole thing. All right, we seem to be on a roll here with Haydn. Here's another string quartet movement, this one from the Opus 20 set. And the antecedent here ends with a PAC in the tonic. Now that's pretty strong closure for the first phrase of a period. Haydn probably wouldn't have done it that way if he planned to just stay in D minor, but of course, given what we're doing here, the consequent phrase is going to modulate. It starts with about a bar of tonic, and it ends with 2 bars that are clearly in the relative major F. But if we want to get fussy about how the modulation actually works, we've got to think through things a little bit. The chord on the downbeat of bar 6 is a G minor 7th, which is 4-7 in D minor. That's not a chord we see very much in the 1770s. It's not unheard of, but it's not a standard predominant at all. Notice as well, though, that it's followed by C dominant 7th, which means we might be inclined to hear the G minor 7th as a 2-7 going to 5-7 in the new key. So maybe we like that as the pivot chord? I don't, actually. I'm more inclined to hear the chord before it, the last D minor triad in bar 5, as the hinge between the keys, being tonic in one key and then a bridging 6 in the other. That's because it's really hard for me to hear the G minor 7 relating backwards. For me, bar 6 points forward to that emerging F major tonic. See if you can hear it that way. All right, and our last example today takes us back to a piece we've seen twice already, the first gondola lead from Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words. We first heard the antecedent phrase back in video 29 when we learned about tonic pedal points. Well, the second phrase modulates from G minor to D minor, the minor dominant, which is our other main destination in minor keys. And again, we've got one of those situations where we could debate exactly where we tip from one key into the other. We start with the same two chords as the antecedent. Then, in the middle of bar 14, there's an applied chord to 5, which resolves to minor 5 in first inversion. Now, by this point, we've come to expect minor 5/6 to be a passing chord within some longer lament bass progression. And Mendelssohn could certainly have done that here. But he didn't do that. Instead of going down, the bass goes back up to G minor in root position. And that move alone tells us that G is no longer the tonic at this point. That is simply not a progression in G minor. So it means we have to reorient ourselves. And when that G minor moves up to A7, there's no question that we've landed in D minor. But we've still got that sticky question of where exactly we feel like we modulated. We might want our pivot chord here in bar 15, but I don't love that because this chord feels just a bit sketchy to me as minor 5/6 in G. One reason is that minor 5/6 doesn't usually follow an applied chord, at least if the composer plans to stay in the home key. Another reason is melodic. Look at the right hand in bar 14. It's got C sharp and E natural, both of which we associate with D minor, but not G minor. And there's also the question of rhythm. Minor 5/6 is a connecting chord, so it usually appears on weak beats or on hypermetrically weak bars. But I hear bar 15 as heavily stressed, so when that D minor triad lands, it sounds like an arrival, not a connecting chord. So for me, the dominant that comes before this is the moment we start to peel away from G minor, making the first chord in bar 14 my pivot. Maybe you'll hear it that way too. Give it a shot. All right, that's all for today, folks. At this point, I hope you can see that the concepts we need to analyze modulations aren't themselves particularly tricky, but also that the act of analysis requires us to think and listen really carefully. I'll be back soon with video number 35, where I introduce augmented sixth chords. I'll see you then.